Vision.
Okay, everyone, so welcome again. And tonight I'm going to talk about the Buddha, and specifically about why the Buddha is so significant, about how to think about the Buddha and how to use the idea of the Buddha to be a kind of additional factor on the path, to help us in our practice, and to see if we can actually use this in a positive way to enhance our practice. And in fact, when you read the suttas, when you read the word of the Buddha, this is actually an important part of the practice. The idea is really to have almost like you have a relationship with the Buddha. What does the Buddha mean to us? How does that whole idea of the Buddha affect our practice? So this is what it's going to be about. And to start out, I'm going to tell you another little story from the suttas. And this is a story of a very famous Buddhist at the time of the Buddha. And for those of you who are from a Buddhist background, you will know this person straight away. From those of you who are not, you may not know about this person. This person's name is Anathapindika. And Anathapindika was one of the main donors to the Buddha, a very generous person. And he donated the very famous monastery, which can still be found in India in the present day, in the famous capital of Savatthi, which was the capital of the larger Kosalan kingdom, one of these large kingdoms in ancient India. The capital was Savatthi, and in that capital was the famous monastery called Anathapindika's Park. You had Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's Park, and this was perhaps the most famous monastery in India, Buddhist monastery in India at the time of the Buddha. Very large and famous place, and you can go there to the present day. You can see some of the ancient ruins. You can sit down there and you can relax, and you can get a feeling of what it's like to meditate in the same monastery where the Buddha meditated 2,500 years ago. That's pretty cool, isn't it? Imagine sitting with the Buddha sat, right, on the same place. It's like you make your hair stand on end, if you know what I mean. It's really kind of amazing. And this actually is possible because some of these places in India are definitely the places where the Buddha was. There's no doubt about that. You recognize the features, the geographical features, you recognize the places are described in the suttas, and the Buddha actually was in these places. And it's kind of amazing to be sitting roughly in the same place where the Buddha was sitting here. Anyway, so Anathapindika. And the story of Anathapindika, and this is the story of his meeting of the Buddha, and that's why I want to talk about this. So Anathapindika, he was a very wealthy merchant, one of the most wealthy people in the large city of Savatthi at that time. And as is often the case, one of his brother-in-law, must have been his wife's brother then, I presume, his brother-in-law, he was also a very wealthy merchant. You know how these things are. And he lived in a different city called Rajagaha. And Rajagaha was the capital city of the Magadhan kingdom or empire. Later on it became it became the largest empire that India has ever seen, 200 years after the time of the Buddha. So he went on a business trip. Actually, that's a good point. I'm just thinking, I'm just translating some of these things, and when I think now, I've translated this, he went on some business, but I should say he went on a business trip, right? That gives a kind of a contemporary ring to it when I say that. Maybe I'm actually coming up with translation ideas as I'm giving the talk. That's interesting. Okay, so forget about that. So he went on a business trip to Rajagaha, basically to meet his brother-in-law, right, who was also very wealthy. And then when it comes into the presence of his brother-in-law is so busy. He's running around doing all kind of things, telling all his workers to prepare the food, prepare the meals, prepare the seats, get the house ready, and he's running around. He doesn't even have time for Anathapindika, who has just arrived. In India, in some of these old societies, the idea of a guest is very important. If you are a guest in someone's house, you look after them. You make sure they get something to eat. This is how it used to be in almost all societies around the world, not that long ago, when we all lived in the countryside and we're not so busy as we are these days in the cities. So he comes to his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law doesn't have any time for him. Then after the whole day has passed, finally his brother-in-law is kind of relaxing a little bit. And Anathapindika asks him, "What's going on? You're running around like a madman. Is there some big wedding happening? Is there some kind of big kind of sacrifice that you are doing? Have you invited the king together with the fourfold army to your house?" If you invite the king and the fourfold army, you need a kind of big preparations. And his brother-in-law says, "No, none of those things. I haven't. There's no wedding. There's nothing happening. Instead, I have invited the Buddha together with the Sangha for tomorrow's meal." Anathapindika, kind of, his eyes go like, it doesn't say this in the text, but I can imagine this is what's happening, right? His eyes kind of go up, and he says, "Did you say Buddha?" He says, "Yes, I did." "Did you say Buddha?" "Yes, I did." "Did you say Buddha?" "Yes, I did." This is actually how the text goes. You have to say it 3 times for it to be really powerful. And you can see just that word Buddha is so powerful, because the word Buddha actually also has a meaning in the ancient Indian languages. The Buddha means the awakened one. It means the one who has woken up from like the dream of our ordinary existence and seen reality, seen the human mind, understood the reality as it actually is. So when he, just by hearing the word Buddha, he's like, "Whoa, there's something really powerful going on." And then he says to his brother-in-law, "Well, is it possible to go and visit this Buddha right now?" "I don't want to wait 1 second." That's basically what he's saying. "Can I go right now?" And he says, "No, now is the wrong time to see the Buddha. Tomorrow morning is the right time." So then, during that night, he's kind of gone to bed, and he's so keen on seeing the Buddha. He gets up 3 times in the middle of the night, thinking it is dawn, ready to go to the Buddha. And then he goes back to bed again, gets up, goes back to bed again, gets up, gets back to bed again. This is the Buddha, right? This is not some ordinary person, someone really, really special. And eventually he gets up. It's getting close to dawn. It's not quite dawn yet, still very dark outside. And he walks out of the house, and he walks through the city gates. And then he becomes frightened because it's pitch black outside. And then he reminds himself of the Buddha. And he reminds himself this is one of the greatest things a human being can do, is to meet someone like this. So he carries on, and eventually he gets to the monastery where the Buddha is staying. It's a place called Cool Grove. Yes, nice name for a place, isn't it? Cool Grove. Kind of cool has a double meaning in English. It's really cool place, and it's also cool in the higher sense. Cool Grove. Maybe next monastery we should call Cool Grove. That's another idea. So, Cool Grove Monastery here. And so he goes, and then when he arrives at the monastery, the Buddha is there. He's doing walking meditation. Walking meditation was also done in those days. It's called chankama in the Pali language. Chankama means like walking back and forth. So the Buddha's, and then he sees Anathapindika coming, and then he says, "Sudatta, please come over here and sit down." And then Sudatta, Anathapindika, same person, he then says to the Buddha, "I hope you have slept well." And then the Buddha gives this beautiful verse back to Anathapindika, and he says, "The person who has given up all the defilements, who has seen the truth and understood the way things actually are, always sleeps well." And Sudatta, of course, the Anathapindika, he bows down to the Buddha, and he's kind of awe-inspired by what is happening. Then the Buddha understands that this is a person who is ready to hear the Dhamma. So he teaches in the Dhamma what is called the gradual training, stage by stage, starting with simple things, going to more advanced things, starting with sila, virtue, generosity, and the giving up of the sensory world, and then that renunciation then leads to samadhi. And when the Buddha knows that his mind is ready, then he teaches him the 4 noble truths, which is the essence of the Buddha's teachings. And then Sutta says very beautifully, as it says in so many places, just as a clean cloth takes the dye evenly and well, in the same way the clean mind that is free of defilements takes the Dhamma, understands the Dhamma, and then has this what is called the experience of the opening the eye of the Dhamma, which is like you reach the first stage of awakening on the Buddhist path. And this is the story of Anathapindika, Sudatta, the idea that he came to the Buddha so full of faith. he sat down, listened to the teachings, the first meeting with the Buddha, and according to the story, he became a stream enter, a sotapanna, someone who understood these teachings all the way to the very core. And then, after this meeting, then of course he goes off and he goes to start this monastery in Savatthi that I mentioned in the beginning. And he goes up and he travels all the way to Savatthi. And there's a beautiful story of how he comes across the Jeta Grove and how he comes across what becomes then Anathapindika's monastery. And he wants to, because he's a very wealthy merchant, he goes to the prince and says, I want to buy your park. Yeah, park is a good place for a monastery. Park is like outside of the city. And then the prince said, the park is not for sale. What if I cover the entire park in gold coins? Will that be okay? I think, I get a bit greedy when he hears about so many gold coins, right? Everyone gets greedy. So he says, okay, maybe that's possible. And then eventually he buys the Jeta Grove in this way for a massive amount of money. But the main story here, and what I find so fascinating, is this combination of the why, how it is possible, with this powerful faith. You can see someone here is enormously strong faith. Just hearing the word of the Buddha gets his whole mind gets changed because of that. And if you don't like the word faith, you can use the word confidence instead, because confidence and faith always go together in Buddhism. Confidence means that you know that you are in presence of something extraordinarily special, something unique, something very powerful, something that has the potential to change your entire life for the better. You know that deep down, and because you know that, this faith is so powerful that when he sits down and listens to the Dhamma from that Buddha, he becomes a stream enter. He sees the Dhamma for the first time right there and then. That is the power of faith. And this is what you see so many places actually in the suttas. You see someone who really has the confidence in the Dhamma or the Buddha and this whole thing that we are doing here also at the Buddha Society, that has the ability to purify your mind so powerfully that from that purification, if you listen to the Dhamma in the right way, actually it does lead precisely to stream entry. So this is very interesting, right? And it is very interesting because it shows you that one of the reasons, perhaps, why there aren't more stream enters, why there aren't more noble ones, Aryas, awakened people in the world, is perhaps because we haven't developed enough faith in this path. Maybe faith is one of the things that we need to develop more of, or confidence, as I said, or you can call it wisdom, because wisdom in Buddhism is the flip side of faith. In other religions, faith kind of stands on its own, but in Buddhism, faith and wisdom always go together. The more wisdom you have, the more faith you have. The more faith you have, the more wisdom you have. So it shows you the potential of faith. So how can we do something with ourselves, our own faith, to develop that in such a way that it can become a power on this path? And I know that, very typically in our Western society especially, very often faith has kind of a bad word, because it means that you're blind, you're just following along, you're kind of being led astray, led by the nose, and all of these kind of things, not really reflecting properly for yourself. But this is not the Buddhist idea of faith at all, and that is why it isn't really all that scary. There's also the kind of Western idea of how we live our lives. We're supposed to be very independent. Independence is one of the things that is really valued in the kind of Western culture. And I think independence is great. There's nothing wrong with that. But it shouldn't be independent to the point where we don't really allow ourselves to gain some of these fundamental things on the Buddhist path, like faith, confidence in something that is truly awe-inspiring, something that truly is worthy of faith. So it's good to be independent. It's good to kind of look at things from a distance and kind of judge things in the right way. But it's also when you see something that really is worthy of faith, really is worthy of confidence, it is also useful to actually allow yourself that happiness, that joy that can come from the idea of faith. So it's very important. So who is this person? Who is the Buddha? I want to talk a little bit about that, because faith in the Buddha, getting a relationship with the Buddha, is really one of the foundational things on the Buddhist path that really, again, can allow us to go a long way in this practice. And one of the things that has often or sometimes worried me a little bit in the Western ideas of Buddhism, in the West we have this idea sometimes of secular Buddhism, yeah? And secular Buddhism means you throw out the things you don't like and you keep what you like. That's dangerous sometimes, because sometimes we don't like the right things, right? We don't know what we should like in the first place. So we have to be careful with just chucking out the stuff we don't like. In fact, I gave a talk quite recently, a podcast called Why Secular Buddhism is Baloney. So if you want to listen to that one, you can. But the idea is that when we have to be careful how we deal with things, yeah? And otherwise, we actually may have some very big problems as a consequence. So why does the Buddha matter so much? And one of the things that you can start off with is in the very famous Mahaparinibbana Sutta, where the Buddha talks about his last travels, his very last days just before he dies. It's a very powerful time when the Buddha, everyone knows the Buddha is about to pass away, and the Buddha kind of gives the final instructions to the Sangha and to everyone. And one of the things he says there is that after my passing, there will be no leader in the Sangha. There will be no one to take charge of the Sangha, the monastic community, or anyone else after I pass away. After I pass away, what will be your leader, what will be your guide, is the teaching, the Dhamma that I have taught, and also the Vinaya. The Vinaya are like the rules and regulations for the monastics. This will be a teaching after I pass away. The practice and the teachings. This is what you should follow. So what are these teachings? Now, sometimes what you can hear from people who are secular Buddhists is that it's not necessary to make a distinction between what the Buddha taught on the one hand and other teachings that come after the Buddha. Yeah, this idea that we just look to the teachings of the Buddha, or we take those to be a primary inspiration on the path. This is sometimes said to be like too fundamentalist, too narrow-minded. Why should we have this focus on the Buddha? But actually, it is not narrow-minded at all, and in part because the Buddha seems to have said that is exactly what we should do. And when you think about it, it makes very good sense that we should actually take the teaching of the Buddha as primary. It makes good sense, and the reason for this is very simple, really. It makes good sense because everything in Buddhism is based on the ideas that were expressed by the Buddha 2,500 years ago. Everything that has come after the Buddha's existence, after the Buddha's life, and his whole life was a life of teaching, everything else is founded on those teachings of the Buddha. Everything else only has a meaning insofar as it refers back to the teachings of the Buddha. The teaching of the Buddha are the foundation for everything. Nothing else could exist if you take away the teachings of the Buddha. Everything else has meaning because of the teachings of the Buddha. So they are extremely important. Nothing else has the right to life without those fundamental teachings. So they matter enormously, right? And because this is where we kind of come back to the very source of the entire Buddhist tradition. And one of the things that we kind of have to assume, if we come to the Dhamma, we come to the teachings of the Buddha, we have to assume that the Buddha had some kind of insight into reality. Yeah, we have to have some kind of faith that the Buddha saw something special, that he had some kind of special understanding of the nature of the human mind and reality. Because if the Buddha didn't have that, then everything else again falls apart. Because everything else is based on the word of the Buddha. Everything else also has no meaning unless the Buddha has some kind of special insight into reality. So the Buddha always has to have a primary place in the Buddhist teachings. But the problem is actually much more worse than that. And the real problem is that apart from the Buddha, all other teachers that have existed in human history are from the very beginning up to the present day, including me sitting here right now. Yeah, I'm kind of the latest. I'm the most dodgy teachings of all that come from me, right? Because I'm the latest. I'm kind of building on everything else. It's like a house of cards. If it all collapses, I collapse, bang, and I'm kind of, that's it. So everything is, everything is so uncertain. And so the problem is that everyone in Buddhist history who has taught Buddhism, from the first disciples of the Buddha down to the present day here, we don't really know who most of these people are. Most of these people are anonymous people, anonymous authors, anonymous teachers who have existed over a long period of time, who have written some nice and inspiring poems perhaps, who have expounded the Abhidhamma Pitaka, who told the stories of the past lives of the Buddha. But we don't know who these teachers are. And sometimes when we take teachings at face value and we don't know the background of the teachers, we don't know if they were enlightened, we don't know if they knew what they were talking about, right? How seriously can we take those teachings? And sometimes we can take them seriously because sometimes they are beautiful, sometimes they are profound, sometimes they elucidate passages in the suttas. But at the end of the day, we don't actually know fully whether they are up to par, whether they have the same power as the teachings of the Buddha. We just don't know. We don't know who the arahants of the world are. Do you know who the arahants of the world are? Can you point out those arahants? Arahants are the enlightened ones, right? We don't know. And sometimes you think you know. And then when you think you know, suddenly that arahant does something that arahants are not supposed to do. Then you think, wait a minute, I've been taken for a ride. I was wrong about this all along. Because it is very, very difficult to know who the arahants are. I know so many people who have been very disillusioned by people who they thought were highly attained, who turned out not to be attained at all, and did all kind of crazy things. So this is really the issue at hand. Yeah, the Buddha is the solid foundation for everything we have in Buddhism. Yes, we can listen to other teachers as well. Yeah, otherwise I shouldn't be sitting here. I should just shut up and walk back to the monks' quarters. I'm not going to do that, but I should do that. And so we can listen to other teachers as well, but we should always come back to the word of the Buddha as the foundation of what Buddhism is about, because that is really what everything else is about. So then the second question is, and this is also a very interesting question, is do we actually know what the Buddha taught? Can we know that? And I will give you some ideas, just some very simple ideas of why we can have a fair amount of certainty that we actually know who the Buddha was. And one of the most basic things is that when you start reading the word of the Buddha, you start reading these suttas. The suttas are the actual word of the Buddha. It always says, at such and such a time, the Buddha, the Blessed One, the Bhagava, was living in such and such a place. And then he said this to the monks, to the nuns, to the lay people. Yeah, so every sutta says that the Buddha was speaking here. Yeah, so can we accept that, or is that kind of just dodgy stuff? Yeah, when they say that, and I think the answer is, of course, we should accept that. It's obvious when you think about, whenever someone in the world says that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, Shakespeare wrote Macbeth. Do you believe that, or do you think it's rubbish? Usually we accept it, right? Because there probably was a person, his name was probably Shakespeare, and he probably wrote both Hamlet and Macbeth and Othello and or whatever else he wrote, right? And we always tend to accept at face value when an author is given like that. And we should do the same with the Buddhist text. It is no different. So when it says in the suttas that the Buddha spoke these things, we should assume that that is correct. We don't really have any good reasons not to think so. Even though some people around the world seem to be skeptical, I think there is no good reason for that. This is the first pointer. The second pointer, which is very obvious if you know a little bit of Pali language. I'm not going to ask how many here know Pali, but I know a little bit of Pali. I can say that much. So when you know a little bit of Pali and you have read many of these texts in the original Pali language, you know that these texts that are said to be spoken by the Buddha, that actually are spoken in this area that we now know as the central Ganges plain, these texts are different from all the other texts. They have a different language. They use a different vocabulary. They have different ideas embedded in them. Once you start reading something else, like the Abhidhamma, for example, you know straight away that this is different text because their entire structure, everything about them is different. If you read the commentaries, if you read the Visuddhimagga, if you read the Mahayana Suttas, if you read anything else apart from those core teachings that are said to be spoken by the Buddha, you know you're reading something else. So actually, it is not that hard to find out. But one of the reasons we don't find out is because we don't read Pali. Yeah, and it's actually quite rare in the world for people to read Pali. Even in academic circles, you'd be surprised how rare it is for the Pali language to be taught. So we know that the Buddha was there. We know that the Buddha taught things. Yeah, we know that the Buddha is really important because he is the founder of this whole thing. We should really listen to what the Buddha taught. And the Buddha himself says, well, these are the teachings. That is your foundation after I pass away. Don't go somewhere else to find out what Buddhism is about. This is where it is found. And so we should take that seriously. And we should really try to come back to what the word of the Buddha actually is. So what does this mean in practice? And one of the things I already said before, it means that the Buddha, because he is so important, having a degree of faith in the Buddha is actually very, very useful. One of the things that I should say at this point, one of the kind of very nice little things that I found in the suttas is that the Buddha explains to us, you know, it's good to have faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha and to reflect on this in a certain way. And one of the reasons the Buddha said, well, because a person who has faith and confidence in something, they have a degree of happiness that a person who does not have any faith and confidence does not have. Yeah, so faith and confidence in something in the world, something more than our ordinary life, actually is a source of happiness for us. It is a source of something that actually lifts our spirit and makes our lives more meaningful. And then the Buddha says, and this is kind of beautiful, yeah? The Buddha said, well, if it is important to respect something, to have faith and confidence in something, then what should I respect in the world? Yeah, so even the Buddha says about himself that he too should have something that he respects. Yeah, that's how important it is. And then he says, well, there is no one in the world that I can see that has the same insight as I have into the nature of reality. So what I will respect instead, I will respect this Dhamma, this teaching, this truth that I have discovered. This will be the thing that I respect. So even the Buddha himself follows his own example. He just doesn't teach us and then he doesn't live according to his own teachings. He lives according to exactly the same teachings as he's giving to us. What he does is what he says. What he says is what he does. There's integrity there. And this is kind of the wonderful thing about the Buddha. But what are some of the consequences? I'm going to talk a little bit about one important consequence of having faith in the word of the Buddha. Because what it means when you have faith in the word of the Buddha, or faith in the Buddha, is that you start to read the teachings of the Buddha in an entirely new way. If you're like Anathapindika and you think, wow, Buddha, wow, this is just so amazing. When you come to the suttas and you start listening to the Buddha, you take it very, very seriously, what is in there. And there are certain things in the suttas that are so fundamental for understanding the Buddhist path in the right way, that if we get it wrong, actually we are really diluting Buddhism to the point where it doesn't really have any meaning anymore. And one of those most important things, and the things that you will see as you read the suttas, well, one of them, of course, is depth of meditation, right? Deep meditation is possible. Of course, so we need to have confidence in that is possible. And I guess most of you here will have some confidence in that it's possible to go a long, long, long way in meditation practice. But and that there are people in the world who actually question that. Yeah, they say, yeah, it's just your kind of your personal experience or whatever. But why should we not believe in personal experience? But there's another thing that the Buddha says that I think is extremely important, and it comes out in the suttas again and again, and it comes out, if we focus on the word of the Buddha, it is so obvious that this is part of the Buddhist path, and this is the idea of rebirth. Yeah, because the idea of rebirth, it changes our understanding of the nature of the world in such a way that it gives us a different goal, in a sense, a different purpose for our existence. And this is so fundamental in the Buddhist teachings. One of the things that the Buddha said on his night of awakening, there was 3 things that he discovered on the night of awakening. Yeah, and these are, if you like, the 3 critical insights on the Buddhist path. And the first one is the idea of rebirth. The second one is the idea of karma, how rebirth comes about, the mechanism behind rebirth. And the third one is the insight into non-self, the awakening experience. These are the 3 core insights of the Buddha on his night of awakening. So if we do, as the secular Buddhists are prone to do, and to throw out the idea of rebirth, we are throwing out what is the Buddha himself said to be one of the critical insights on his night of awakening. And this is really problematic. Yeah, this is really problematic if you have faith that the Buddha really knew what he was talking about. In fact, if you throw out the idea of rebirth, what you are saying is that you don't really believe in the awakening of the Buddha. You believe the Buddha got it wrong. That's what you are saying. And if you believe the Buddha got it wrong, can you really call yourself a Buddhist at all? The Buddha got it wrong, yeah, but I'm a Buddhist anyway. I go according to my own ideas. That's kind of dodgy. The whole purpose of being a Buddhist is that you have some kind of refuge in the Buddhist teachings. It is the idea that we accept that there is something greater than us in the world. There are spiritual practitioners who have insights and understandings beyond the norm, and who are worth placing faith and confidence in. This is kind of the whole purpose of the Buddhist path. And so if you take your refuge in the Buddha, you should take these teachings extremely seriously. They are really important. If the Buddha says is rebirth cheapest, I better think about it at least. Yeah, I can't really believe it straight away, but at least I should take it seriously. I shouldn't reject it as nonsense, because if I do, I'm repudiating the entire Buddhist awakening experience. And that is kind of a bad idea. Yeah. Especially if you are a Buddhist. So this is kind of the issues here that are at stake. Yeah, there's very, very high things at stake, and the problem is, it was interesting. I was just talking to one of our lay guests the other night, and someone is writing a book on the psychology of Buddhist meditation, and very, very nice fellow. He's come all the way from Germany to stay at our monastery. Actually, we do have a few German monks around. So Venerable is also actually from Germany originally, but now I guess, I'm not sure what you are now. Aussie German? Yeah? Double, okay, good. So that's like many Aussies, double citizenship. So he came and he asked me this question. We're talking about things like rebirth, etc. And he asks me, well, what is the best evidence for rebirth? And you can come up with lots of evidence for rebirth. That you can say, there have been all of these near-death experiences. You have the children who remember past lives. You have all of these kind of really weird things that go on in the mind that have been kind of, written about by various kinds of doctors and scientists over the years. It's actually a lot of interesting evidence that point in the direction of rebirth. And then you may find someone, you may meet a certain monk maybe, or someone who has had memories of past life, and they will tell you to your face there is rebirth. And you think, all right, okay, very interesting. But the most powerful evidence for rebirth, and this is what kind of shocked this fellow. He's a kind of very rational person, PhD and writing books and things. I said the most important evidence for rebirth is that the Buddha said there is rebirth. To me, that is the most important thing. If the greatest spiritual genius in human history, if this awesome person that comes out of the suttas as someone who really had a special insight into the nature of the human mind, if that person said there's rebirth, there's no way I can dismiss it. I have to take it seriously. And this is where these kind of things come from. And this is really the right attitude if you're going to be a Buddhist. This is the main reason why we should believe in something like rebirth, is simply because the Buddha said it. Now, there is an important point here. An important point, of course, is that many people will say that the idea of rebirth goes against our cultural inheritance in the West. It goes against, maybe people will say, the scientific worldview and all of these kind of things. But be very careful if you take that kind of standpoint, because science has certain truths, and we should never reject scientific truths as Buddhists, because we are all seekers of truth. So wherever there is truth, we should look for truth, and we should accept truth as it is. But we should also understand the limits of the scientific approach. And when it comes to understanding the mind, the science is still in kindergarten. They have barely started in kindergarten yet. They have a long way to go before they get their PhD in mind science. So this scientific world, and I think this is generally accepted, has a very, very weak understanding of what the mind is. In fact, it is called the hard problem of consciousness, because no one really grasps what it is about. So because of that, sometimes we don't have to be so afraid of going against kind of the generally accepted ideas in our society. Because what happens is that we are all trapped by our social conditioning. We are born in a certain society. There is a certain paradigm, a certain worldview that is accepted in our society, and we're all trapped by that to some extent. But we should remember that every age has its own priorities. Every age has its own fashions. Philosophy also goes in fashionable circles. You have certain philosophical ideas that are dominant, and you have other philosophical ideas, and they kind of cycle around each other. So we should remember that we also are trapped in our own cultural conditioning, and we should not allow ourselves to forget that, so we can stand back a little bit and remember that actually there are things that our culture quite likely has got wrong. In 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years' time, things may have changed dramatically. Worldview may be very different. And if we have rejected rebirth based merely on some kind of cultural conditioning, some kind of cultural preference that our society has now, then we're going to regret it later on, because we will understand that actually the Buddha had a far deeper insight into what was going on. So this is, to me, the right way of reflecting about the Buddha. Taking the Buddha first, and then understanding our cultural conditioning second. Not throwing out the word of the Buddha too easily, because if we do that, we may throw out something very valuable, far deeper than what we can be understood in our contemporary society. But I want to come back towards the end of this talk, back toward this idea of what the Buddha actually means to us. How can we make the Buddha more meaningful? How can we deepen this understanding? So yes, read the word of the Buddha, read the suttas, take what the Buddha said really, really seriously, contemplate it carefully before you throw anything away. All of that is a very important part of it. And you will come to appreciate the Buddha as a person merely by reading what he said. But there's more to it. There's also the idea of the Buddha as a historical person. Who was he? What was he like? How can we have a relationship to the Buddha? And one of the ways that I like to think about the Buddha, and one of the ways that make the Buddha to me very powerful and very present, so when you read the suttas, you get this feeling that the Buddha is actually talking to you. You are like the disciple of the Buddha in a sense. You listen to him. And one way of doing that is to remember that when the Buddha taught the suttas, when the Buddha taught these things 2,500 years ago, he knew that these teachings were going to carry on for a very long time into the future. The Buddha talks about setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma. And the wheel of the Dhamma is this momentum that the teaching has. Once you get it started, once you teach it, you know it's going to spread out from one culture to another, from one time to another, from one era to another one. Because these teachings are so powerful, people will naturally want to spread them out. And because the Buddha knew that these teachings will be spread out into vast, large parts of the world, he taught them in such a way that they are universally valid. They are not kind of caught up with all the cultural trappings of ancient India. They're not caught up with a particular worldview that existed then. But they are expressed in a universal way that everyone can understand. So when the Buddha taught these teachings 2,500 years ago, he actually thought about all the people afterwards. He thought about people learning these teachings around the world in all of these different times. So when you read the suttas, when you listen to someone reading them out and explaining what they are, you're actually being a disciple of the Buddha in a very direct way, because the Buddha did actually think about you or about people in your situation when he gave these teachings. So remember that when you read these teachings. When the Buddha says the Four Noble Truths, there is suffering, he's talking to you. There's a cause of suffering. He's talking to you for you to understand what is going on. This is about your mind, your life, and the Buddha is talking directly to you. And once you get this feeling that the Buddha actually is talking to you, because he is talking to everyone, teachings are universal, then the word of the Buddha takes on a life, that take on an urgency that is very hard to get if you don't think like that. The Buddha, for goodness sake, is my teacher. It's not just Ajahn Brahm or Ajahn Chah or, some other contemporary teacher. The Buddha is my teacher, for goodness sake. You start to get closer to the idea of the Buddha himself when you start thinking like that. He is giving you these teachings because he knows you will be capable to understand them. If you listen carefully, if you read every word, if you contemplate what is going on, you don't get up too fast afterwards, but you actually try to understand what these words actually are about. And then, when you start to think like this, here is this person who gave you these teachings, you start to want to bow down to the Buddha. You start to get this feeling inside that there's something really amazing going on with this person. Here is someone who has the gift of all the happiness that you ever wanted in your life. In fact, far more happiness that you can even imagine was possible. The Buddha is telling you is available for you if you practice in this particular way. Here is someone who teaches you the overcoming of all suffering, all the problems in your life. Here is someone who has the key to the very meaning of life itself. And that's kind of astonishing when you start to understand that this is what these teachings are really about. And when you start to understand that, you realize you have come across the greatest treasure that is possible to find in human existence. Nothing can be more profound, more beautiful, more inspiring than these things. Everything in the world pales by comparison. It is so profound. It is so beautiful. And then, when you start to get that, you just want to bow down to the Buddha. Tears coming to your eyes because you understand how powerful this is. And as you do that, you bow down in a new way. And you understand why it is that even here we bow down to, this is not the Buddha. What is this? A metal statue? But it represents the Buddha. Now you know why we bow down to a metal statue. Because if done in the right way, it brings up these very powerful and beautiful emotions. This is the right way of thinking about the Buddha. This is how you develop that faith. And sometimes I like to do this exercise of thinking about myself meeting the Buddha in the forest, what that actually might feel like to meet the Buddha. And I think it would be, well, initially it would be scary, right? Because the Buddha is just, wow, the Buddha is the Buddha. The Buddha is not just anyone. So it's kind of, the Buddha has this incredible reputation. He's a man who can probably read your mind. He's a man who can kind of know everything about you just by looking at you once. Bing, now I know who you are. He's this person with the cosmic vision and everything. And you're kind of a little bit worried about what's going to happen when you come with your defilements into the presence of the Buddha. Oh, well, I'm getting upset. I'm thinking about what I'm going to eat this evening. It's not appropriate in the presence of the Buddha. Think right way. Think the right thing. Don't think stupid things. Okay, you can't do that. Don't think about an elephant. And of course, you're going to think about that elephant. So you approach the Buddha. Yeah, and as you approach the Buddha, you are a little bit concerned. You are a little bit worried. But then you see the Buddha sitting at the root of a tree, as he often would. And you see this beautiful person, looking very much like a monk. Doesn't look like anything special. Very ordinary, wearing robes a little bit like this. Having a shaven head. Sitting very peacefully at the root of a tree. There's no movement discernible, because the Buddha is really completely at peace. And as you see this, you start to calm down. You You start to feel more confident. You start to feel there's nothing to fear from this person. This is obviously a person with very profound and beautiful goodwill. So you approach the Buddha, starting to relax more. And then, as you come up to the Buddha, the closer you get, the more you feel kind of part of this field of kindness, this field of peace that permeates the space beyond the Buddha, all the way around. You know what it's like sometimes? Sometimes in the world, we go to a place, and when you go to a place, it has a certain feeling about it. Some places feel bad, some places feel like there's something bad has happened there, other places feel really peaceful. Yeah, it is almost as if our minds, our beings, had some kind of effect on the world around us. If you come into the meditation hall at Bodhinyana Monastery, many people say it feels peaceful. There's a certain power in that hall. There are other places that feel bad. I have been to some of those places. They're not nice at all. And when you come to the presence of the Buddha, you feel that presence of the Buddha. It feels peaceful. It feels very powerful. So you sit down in the presence of the Buddha, and then the Buddha says to you, "How are you?" What do you answer the Buddha? What is the right answer to the Buddha when he says, "What are you?" Kind of your mind is racing, trying to find the right answer. What you really want to say is that you have a problem, right? But you say, okay, I'm good. That's kind of the default answer everyone has. I'm good. And the Buddha says, "Are you sure?" No. I'm the only one who says that. The Buddha never says that. "Are you sure?" I'm the only evil one who goes around asking people, "Are you really sure about that?" I'm going to give a talk later on about the question, "How are you?" That will be my next talk here at Dhamma Center here. Maybe. We'll see what happens. The Buddha says, "How are you?" Yeah, and you can feel the kindness of someone like the Buddha. Again, this feeling of being really at ease in the presence. And then the Buddha says, "Well, why have you come here? Yeah, what do you want?" And of course, very often our questions are so simple, and you start to feel a bit foolish. You start to feel that you are in the presence of someone who is really different from anyone you've ever met before. There is a peace about this person. There is a kindness, there's a profundity, a depth to this person that is actually almost impossible to find. You don't find it anywhere else in the whole world. And you get this feeling right now, there's something here really special. And then you feel your question is about your relationship with your wife or husband, right? It feels kind of silly. Can I really ask this question? But then because the Buddha asked, "Okay, I'm having a problem with my husband, my wife, please give me some advice." And of course the Buddha, he has all the kindness in the world. So he tells you to have compassion, to have understanding, to see things from the other person's point of view, and not to take it too seriously. And then he says to just live well, live with kindness, and as you do that, you will create a better life for yourself. A very simple answer to the question. The Buddha's answer are usually very simple. The more complicated someone's Dhamma talk is, the less wisdom they have, right? So I'm not sure what that says about me, but probably says something bad about me. Simple things, right? The Buddha, because he has the profundity of his personality. He doesn't need to pretend to be profound by using fancy words and fancy kind of philosophy. The profundity speaks for itself by the presence of the Buddha. And at this point, when you start hearing the Buddha in this way, you start to understand what the Buddha is about. You start to feel the presence of this awesome person giving this very simple answer to you. This whole experience is so powerful. It is such a beautiful experience. You know that there's something very special going on here. And then when the Buddha has finished, all you want to do is you want to bow down. You want to bow down and say thank you to the Buddha for your wonderful teaching, even though it was very, very simple. Most of the teaching was just in the conduct of the Buddha, the way he was, not what he said. Why is it that sometimes we find it so hard to bow down to somebody? And very often the reason why we find it hard to bow down is because maybe there is an ego there, behind that person. And if there is an ego there, maybe there's a feeling that the person will kind of take you for a ride, or will kind of abuse you, or will use you as a disciple because there's an ego there. If you bow down to someone who has an ego and who does this because they maybe want some power over you, whatever, then it is uncomfortable. But the point about the Buddha is that there is no feeling of ego. There's no feeling of a person who does this for any kind of ulterior motive. There's no ulterior motive. The Buddha is just there. His only purpose in the world is to be kind. His only purpose in the world is to be compassionate. So the same thing when we come here to this hall and you bow down to the Buddha. Remember what it really is about. Remember that here are these beautiful teachings. Here is this incredible master, the most powerful spiritual person in the history of humankind. This is what you're bowing down to. You're bowing down to something fundamentally beautiful and powerful. No ego, no self, no one who's going to take you for a ride or kind of lead you in the wrong direction. That is what this really is about. And as you're able to build up this relationship with the Buddha, as you're able to get joy out of a simple thing like bowing, it's a wonderful thing. There's a beautiful anecdote that someone told me. This anecdote was this monk who tells a story of how in his dream he was bowing down to another monk, a very famous monk. And because he was bowing down to this monk in his dream, and because this other monk was so famous, he got so much bliss out of bowing down that he woke up from all this bliss and he went straight into a deep state of samadhi straight away. Yeah, that is the power of faith. And so the idea is, if you can use this idea of faith, use this idea of confidence, and you can bow down to the Buddha, bow down to the Dhamma, contemplate what the Aryan noble Sangha really is about, and generate some of that happiness because you know you are in the presence of something truly awesome, then you have gone a long way on the Buddhist path, and you have access to something very powerful that not many people in the world have access to. You have access to a joy, to a happiness and calm that actually is actually quite hard to get hold of otherwise. And then you are doing what the Buddha calls the Buddhanusati, contemplation of the Buddha, contemplation of the Dhamma, contemplation of the Sangha, and you are on the path to achieving similar kind of states of meditation yourself. Okay, everyone, so that is all for today.